Good evening, everyone. I want to welcome you to the first lecture of the Art and Research Center's Spring 2021 semester. And before we get on with the program, I just want to take a moment to thank our funders, in particular the Knight Foundation, who's a great supporter of everything we do and quite essential in these digital Zoom projects that we're doing. To tonight's program, it is my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Edward Chambers, who's an artist, curator, and art historian, currently a professor of African diaspora art history in the Department of Art and Art History at the University of Texas at Austin. Dr. Chambers has since the early 1980s been involved in organizing and curating a considerable number of artist exhibitions. In addition to this curatorial work, he has written extensively about the work of artists in the United Kingdom and other countries, including Australia, Jamaica, and the United States. His articles and other texts have been published in field-defining magazines and journals, such as Third Text in London, Art Papers in Atlanta, and Art Monthly in London. A collection of his articles and essays titled Run Through the Jungle was published in 1999 by the Institute of International Visual Arts in London. His book, Things Done Changed, The Cultural Politics of Recent Black Artists in Britain was published in 2012. In 2014, he published Black Artists in British Art, a history since the 1950s. And in 2016, he published Roots and Culture, Cultural Politics in the Making of Black Britain. In 2019, he edited the Routledge Companion to African American Art History. And just this year, he published his latest book. It's titled World is Africa, Writings on Diaspora Art. So please, without further ado, a virtual welcome to Dr. Eddie Chambers. Dr. Chambers, please.
That's thank you so much, Gene. I really appreciate that introduction. So I'm going just by way of a very brief preamble. I'm going to be talking about what I call the fetishization of the 1980s. The 1980s has come up or been the subject in some respects of the seminars that have preceded this lecture. So I've talked a little bit about the 1980s. I'm going to talk about it in a different way this evening. I'm going to be talking about it, about the ways in which the British art world is perhaps overemphasizing the work of certain artists, a limited number of artists associated with the 1980s. So I shall talk for probably around about 50 minutes or so, certainly no more than 50 minutes. In fact, I should get my timer. Oh, here it is. And then hopefully there'll be time for any questions or contributions or anything that anybody would like to share. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to make a start now. Month on month, year on year, we have witnessed a pronounced escalation of what might be regarded as the fetishization of the 1980s, as regards the fortunes and profiles of Black British artists. Rather than their wider and respective individual practices being engaged with and keeping step with the onward march of time, it is work from the best part of 4 decades ago that has come to represent the current profile of Black artists. More than that, certain practitioners associated with the Black visual arts activity of the 1980s have come to be a conduit for this fetishization. Whilst it might possibly now be on the wane, it is perhaps difficult to say for certain when the excessive and irrational commitment to or obsession with Black artists of the 1980s began. Certainly, David A. Bailey, Ian Bowcombe, and Sonia Boyce had it right when, in their introduction to Shades of Black, Assembling Black Arts in 1980s Britain, they cited the persuasive view that beginnings are unstable things. But whilst identifying the starting point for the fetishization of Black British artists of the 1980s might be a matter of conjecture and speculation, the publication of the aforementioned book, which I'm shown the cover at the moment, and the related conference might well have been the moment the fetishization of the 1980s was set in train. The conference from which the 2005 book drew its title, sorry, a 2006 book, I beg your pardon, drew its title, had taken place 4 years earlier at Duke University, Durham, North Carolina, between the 19th and the 22nd of April, 2001. Bauckham et al. Had, though, cited a conversation that had taken place some 4 years before the conference in 1997 as a possible starting point for what began as a perhaps not unreasonable interest in certain Black artist practices. Bauckham had apparently asked Boyce, Shudder Biswas, and Keith Piper, the three set to exhibit together in a show called The Unmapped Body, Three Black British Artists at Yale University Art Gallery, the dates for that being October the 13th, 1998 to January the 3rd, 1999. So Bauckham apparently asked, "What do you think of doing a book about the Black British art movement of the 1980s?" Unquote. This conversation reportedly took place in the fall of 1997, which is as significant a period as any in the history of Black British artists. Firstly, the British art world had begun to reiterate its ambivalence to what it perceived as the overly strident, out of step with the times practices of certain artists who emerged into visibility in the 1980s. Secondly, a consideration of immense proportion was the ways in which the 1990s gave rise to a new type of Black British artist. Steve McQueen, Chris O'Feely, and here I'm showing one of Chris O'Feely's paintings using elephant dung, with which he was associated very heavily at this point in the late 1990s, mid to late 1990s. So Chris O'Feely, new type of Black British artist, and Yinka Shonibari, as I'm showing here an image of Yinka Shonibari in front of a commission for the Trafalgar Square fourth plinth. These artists distinguished themselves and were recognized for the ways in which they made new types of work, and both critiqued and utilized the Black image in ways that the art world regarded as setting these practitioners aside from the mass of Black artists who emerged during the 1980s. These artists were, furthermore, more likely to be selected as the state's artists of choice for the adornment of public buildings and other commissions. At precisely the moment in which McQueen et al. Were, in terms of exposure, adulation, and critique, starting to run rings around Black artists of the 1980s, certain people were choosing to disregard truly fascinating developments and begin instead to fix their gaze on a decade that had either slipped into history or been superseded by the cataclysmic 1990s changes in the zeitgeist. Perhaps the quest to identify just where the fixation with Black artists of the 1980s began and started to gather steam is something of a fruitless task. After all, Bauckham, in posing his question to Boyce, Biswas, and Piper, was apparently motivated by consideration of the 10/8 publication, Critical Decade, Black British Photography in the 1980s. Thus, we move backwards in time from 2005 to 2001 to 1997 to 1992. The attention paid to Black British artists of the 1980s was, in any event, short-lived. And by the late 1980s, much of the mainstream art world declared itself to be either bored with what it took to be the totality of their practices, or declared itself outraged that this practice had garnered any sort of attention or exposure in the first place. A selection of Black British artists of the 1980s were included in Rashid Areen's landmark exhibition of 1989, The Other Story. Now I'm just going to show you briefly, I think I have about 5 images of The Other Story, including the poster for the exhibition and several installation shots of the Manchester iteration. So the exhibition opened at Hayward Gallery in London, then it toured to a couple of venues, one in Wolverhampton and Manchester. So the installation shots that you're about to see are The Other Story in Manchester. Most of these artists found themselves swept up in vociferous reactions to the exhibition, perhaps typified by Evening Standard art critic Brian Sewell. Evening Standard is the daily paper of London, the evening paper of London. Yes, the Evening Standard art critic Brian Sewell, whose review of the show The Other Story was titled Black Pride and Prejudice, which is this is a scan of the review. Underneath the title in enlarged type was the following quote: "They argue that they are rejected and ignored when they are nothing of the kind," unquote. Within the review, Sewell was described as critic of the year, and in language which would come to see him excel as a pantomime villain of choice during the following decade, he opined, "Apart from Sonia Boyce and Donald Locke, we have seen it all before. Having either no traditions of their own or traditions so exhausted that no nourishment is to be drawn from them, these artists parrot Western visual idioms that they do not understand and that have been exposed as silly and pretentious. That they should demand serious attention for their third-rate imitations of the white man's cliche must seem outrageous to all who care to judge by quality. Talent in the white West is an extremely rare phenomenon, and most Western art is indifferent at best. I see no reason to distort the judgment that damns it so as to praise the work of artists just as bad or worse, because they make a noisy business of being Black." So I want to just briefly draw attention or revisit the second part of the last sentence, because in many respects, the work of Feely, McQueen, and Shonibari could be said to have been embraced because these artists were not, quote unquote, making a noisy business of being Black. "1992 notwithstanding, it was beyond question the shades of Black book that gave a fillip to the partial, revisionist, nostalgic, and decidedly curious readings of the 1980s with which the British art world is currently fixated. The book gave the 1980s a certain convenient and opportunistic elasticity, in effect creating a bandwagon that all manner of people with little to nothing in the way of pronounced associations with Black and British artists of the 1980s could jump on. Somewhat as a matter of routine, Black artists found themselves being studied, reviewed, even curated by those with a calculated interest in using said artists as some sort of career stepping stone. This piecemeal and short-term attention created particularly unstable foundations. The contents of Shades of Black threw into sharp relief an arguably accentuated role for certain artists who emerged into visibility in the 1980s, but equally worryingly and problematically, the book demonstrated a comprehensive setting to one side of many artists, Sakari Douglas Camp, Denzel Forrester, et al., for whom the 1980s was an important decade in the launching or establishing of their careers. It is this double deficiency on which the current fetishization of Black artists of the 1980s rests. Not surprisingly, perhaps, the resurgence of interest in Black artists' work of the 1980s is taken in certain circles to be a part and parcel of a celebratory moment of the unstoppable progress of Black artists within British art. Caroline Rue, writing in the Financial Times, began her review of The Places Here, a key exhibition in the fetishization of the 1980s narratives, to be discussed presently, albeit relatively briefly. So Rue began her review of The Places Here with, last week, the artist John Ackramfry received the prestigious £40,000 Artist Mundi Prize for Auto de Fe, a film delving into the reality of persecution through the lens of luscious period drama. Sonia Boyce, a Royal Academician since 2016, opened a solo show at the ICA in London, in which stills of film dancers are abstracted into a nearly domestic wallpaper. Zarina Bimji was just back from a research trip to her place of birth, Uganda, preparation for a show at Tate Britain next year. And Lubaina Himid was celebrating the positive reviews of simultaneous solo exhibitions, one in Oxford and one in Bristol. So these are sentiments which we're taken to point to this unstoppable, substantial progress being made by Black artists on a number of fronts. And Rue identifies what she sees as signifiers of this progress. And in this mix, we see this fetishization of Black artists of the 1980s. Notwithstanding such blinkered and partial adulation, institutional support of Black artists has always been skewed and dysfunctional, and the favoured few aside, the vast majority of Black artists find that success or status is generally accorded them only retrospectively. What I mean by this is that we have a pronounced history of acclaim being assigned to Black artists upon their passing or years after their passing. It was a number of years following his death in 1990 that Aubrey Williams was recognised by increased attention from Tate Britain. Likewise, Roland Moody, having died in 1984, was eventually, and of course posthumously, hailed as, quote, one of Britain's most remarkable modernist sculptors, unquote, 2 decades after his death. Donald Rodney, who passed away in 1998, has subsequently been the subject of much scholarly and institutional attention, including the acquisition of his work by Tate Britain. His work had not been considered good enough for inclusion in the 1990 and 1995 iterations of the British Art Show. This is a broad survey of British art, emerging British artists, that takes place every 5 years. That's hence my reference to 1990 and 1995. His work had not been considered good enough for inclusion in 1990 and 1995 iterations of the British Art Show, though in death, his work was promptly included in the manifestation of the exhibition that took place in 2000. Such institutional antics are nothing new for Black artists, but the fetishization of the 1980s opened up a new front in that certain artists found themselves being recognized 30 or so years after they had made a variety of contributions. And this is another extra. This is an extract from another review of the other story, also by the same reviewer that I mentioned earlier. So Roux continued, in retrospect, these young black artists were pioneers, making bold, brave work fit to be shown in tough and sometimes ad hoc spaces. Its strong physical presence has stood the test of time. And if collage and image and text prevail, it is because these practitioners, as well as being influenced by movements like Dada and artists such as Rauschenberg that education had brought to them, were quite literally finding a way to piece together alternative dialogues. So one of the difficulties with these sentiments is that the Financial Times took no interest in these black artists of the 1980s. It did run a review of one exhibition, a show called From Two Worlds, that was at the Whitechapel Art Gallery in '86. But the tone of that review and that review aside, the Financial Times took no interest in black British artists of the 1980s. Probably the most celebrated of Lou Boehner Himid's curated exhibitions centered on the practices of black women artists was The Thin Black Line, which took place in a concourse passageway area of London's ICA in the autumn of 1985. In 2011, however, Himid and Paul Goodwin worked with Tate Britain to stage Thin Black Lines, the S in parentheses at the end of line, so Thin Black Lines, a revisiting of 3 women artists exhibitions of the 1980s, which brought together a number of pieces and related documentation. The display took place in a spacious, roomy gallery in Tate Britain, and its installation was in marked contrast to the environment in which its namesake was located some quarter of a century earlier. The year before Thin Black Lines, Acon Gallery, London, presented an appraisal of sorts of the Other Story exhibition, put together by Nira Ratman, entitled A Missing History, The Other Story Revisited. It featured a number of artists included in the original exhibition, plus 2, Shaili Kumari Burman and Shetaba Biswas, who were not. The press release for A Missing History, The Other Story Revisited, likened the Other Story to several previous historically significant exhibitions. Along with Magicians de la Terre, the 1993 edition of the Whitney Biennale and Documenta 11, The Other Story is one of the key exhibitions that over the last 20 years have impacted on the ways in which a previously closed art world was opened up to issues around post-colonialism, migration, exile, diaspora, and globalization. Unsurprisingly, each of these exhibitions generated controversy, with heated discussions taking place at the time of each one. A Missing History, The Other Story Revisited, is an opportunity to look back on these debates at the 20-year anniversary mark, as well as to exhibit the works of 11 of the 24 artists in the original show and 2 artists who were not in the show. It is perhaps in the nature of curating, art criticism and art scholarship to revisit exhibitions, artists and art movements from the recent past, the more distant past, and points in between. But the relative proliferation of displays and exhibitions such as these in London and elsewhere in the country tended to be the means by which certain artists achieved any sort of return to visibility. Having been somewhat shortchanged in terms of their original Warholian 15 minutes, certain artists found that it was only through looks back to the 1980s moments that their work was temporarily restored to the public visibility. Sonia Dyer, in reviewing an exhibition by Claudette Johnson, to be referenced subsequently if time allows, Sonia Dyer began her review of an exhibition by Claudette Johnson with, 2017 has turned out to be a rather momentous year for many artists associated with the Black Art Group. Formed in Wolverhampton in 1979, initially by 4 young Black British artists, and Dyer then cites several names, including Keith Piper, Marlene Smith, and Don Rodney. The group became synonymous with work that articulated concerns around institutional racism and the UK's imperial past in conversation with the contentious history of European art. With a number of half-truths and inaccuracies crammed into a couple of sentences, one wonders about the extent to which other branches of art history are peppered with such misremembering and falsehoods. Art critics might balk at the idea that what they offer is equivalent to journalism, but where sloppy art criticism and sloppy journalism meet is in the realm of the willful or uninformed peddling of untruths. Partial, incomplete, and decidedly fragmentary scholarship is part and parcel of the fetishization of the 1980s. Perhaps one of the most substantial manifestations of the fetishization of the 1980s was The Places Here, a large-scale exhibition that took place at Nottingham Contemporary from the 4th of February till 1st of May 2017. Though other smaller reflections of the period had taken place previously, The Places Here proved to be the largest curatorial undertakings that had the Black 1980s as its focus. So I'm just going to show you a few, I think probably 3 installation views, and these are all from Nottingham. The exhibition did tour to South London Gallery, but these views are all from London. Sorry, I beg your pardon. These views are all from Nottingham. So this is from the press release. The starting point for this exhibition is a pivotal decade for British culture and politics, the 1980s, spanning painting, sculpture, photography, film, and archives. The Places Here brings together a wide range of works by more than 30 artists and collectives. The questions they ask about identity, representation, and what culture is for remain vital today. This exhibition traces some of the urgent conversations that were taking place between Black artists, writers, and thinkers during the 1980s, against a backdrop of civil unrest and divisive national politics. They were exploring their relationship to Britain's colonial past as well as to art history. Many artists were looking to the civil rights movement in America, Black feminism, Pan-Africanism, the struggle over apartheid, and the emergent fields of post-colonial and cultural studies. Though characterized by a distinct partiality, this was truly an everything but the kitchen sink revisiting of the 1980s, which even found room or made room for an early to mid 1970s work by Rashida Reen. Alongside work from the 1980s, The Places Here made room for video, film, archival, and contextual material. Given the pretensions of The Places Here for breadth and depth, the exhibition had the unmistakable appearance of giving itself over to a disproportionately large body of work by Hamid. Her work appeared in several of the exhibition's sections. Indeed, the title of the exhibition was borrowed from her work, and the second, sorry, I'll read that again. The title of the exhibition was borrowed from her work. And here I'm showing you a large installation of work of Hamid, that with all the work appearing throughout the rest of the exhibition. And what I was wanting to say, which it's slightly scrambled in my notes here, is that the places here drew from one of her works. So the places here was very much synonymous with Lubena Hamid. Indeed, so ubiquitous was Hamid's presence within the exhibition that, together with concurrent displays of her work at Modern Art Oxford and Spike Art in Bristol, she built up a head of steam that saw her shortlisted and eventually winning the Turner Prize. Nothing epitomizes the fetishization of the 1980s quite as much as the unprecedented and unbridled press adulation with which the places here was greeted. Caroline Elbauer, writing for the website ArtNet in January 2017, reported, "The exhibition takes as its starting point a period of divisive politics and inequality, which we see everywhere echoed today. Many works in the exhibition ask us to consider how we see ourselves as a society, a cultural community, and as the outcome of different historical processes. Thinking about these questions and art's ability to articulate them seems more vital than ever," the curators of the exhibition told ArtNet News. This, though, was as nothing compared to the fulsome sentiments expressed by journalists such as Laura Cummings, who, writing in Observer, again in January 2017, declared, "To describe this show as a revelation would be true, but an understatement." And, quote, "The work here was often made when the artists were barely out of college. It is an art of protest, declaration, revelation, news. It is art as a form of public speech. But what's striking too is just how often it draws on art history. Janches, and of course the references to Gavin Janches, is playing with pop conventions. Sonia Boyce's shattering 4-part painting, Lay Back, Keep Quiet and Think of What Made Britain So Great, pits Britain's colonial past against the fetching patterns of William Morris. Rashida Reen's chillingly stylish grid, combining gleaming green panels with photo montages of AWACS surveillance planes in the first Gulf War, drives minimalism straight into politics." So one of the problems, I alluded to this earlier in terms of the Financial Times review. There's a recurring problem that Laura Cummings, writing in the Observer, the Observer took no interest in this work, did not run any reviews of these artists' work in the 1980s. So this is very much a kind of a disingenuous retrospective embrace of these artists. There are reasons. I speculate about reasons behind this, which I hope in the time remaining. Well, we haven't got that much time remaining, but I hope in the time remaining we can start to unpack. Cummings was joined in her hero worshipping of the exhibition by the likes of Veronica Simpson, who, writing for Studio International in February 2017, asserted that the places here resonates powerfully with today's cultural and political zeitgeist. Before continuing, the timing of this show could hardly be better. An exploration of a period of great political unrest, characterized by widespread paranoia about immigration, stoked by politicians happy to appeal to people's worst instincts in order to win votes, amid huge disaffection with the political establishment. Sounds familiar? Well, that was then, not now. The Places Here examined Britain in the 1980s through the prism of a group of young Black and Asian artists who were trying to penetrate the impermeable crust of Western art world complacency via painting, photography, installation, sculpture, and video. And now I may possibly have to jump over a bit. There's a bit of my notes that I really want to focus on. But having said that, let me just press on. I think we have about 10 minutes or so left. I mean, maybe a few minutes more than 10, but let's press on. Other equally generous press coverage was offered online by Amuse, 8th of February 2017. Its coverage of the Places Here declaring, the exhibition surveys a decade of British past in which racial division and economic inequality were rife. But out of this hotbed of ideas came a new generation of thought, unquote. This coverage contrasted markedly and sharply with the pronounced lack of recognition of these artists and this work back in the 1980s. Further, as was perhaps typified by the antagonistic expression of Sewell quoted earlier, much of the press and media was scornful of Black artists' work of and during the 1980s, particularly that which it read as having pronounced social, political, or racial narratives. So what I'm arguing here is the reasons certain Black artists were ignored in the 1980s, excuse me, by the press and media were the same reasons why this same work is enthusiastically embraced 30 years later. Excuse me. The Observer's stablemate, The Guardian, had taken a somewhat piecemeal interest in Black British artists' exhibitions of the 1980s, and its art critic, Valdemar Januchak, had declared himself something of a cheerleader for Sonia Boyce's work in particular. In 1985, Januchak had responded to The Thin Black Line favourably, reviewing it in the Guardian newspaper. Though his tone was supposedly generous, his review was located within the narrow and short-sighted confines of the notion that these artists were, quote unquote, angry, and that this exhibition was a collective reflection of their agitated state of mind. In blatant disregard for the rules of journalism and a refusal to use a thesaurus, Januchak used the word anger or angry 4 times, and for good measure, his review was titled, quote unquote, Anger at Hand. The subtitle, too, left readers in no doubt as to how he summed up the show. It spoke of, quote, the barely controlled fury, unquote, of the exhibition. Elsewhere in the review, Januchak gave the impression that he was discussing the activities of an uncontrollable mob rather than art by artists who, for the most part, had passed through or were passing through the higher education system. So there's another exhibition called Into the Open that that was reviewed by the Guardian art critic Valdemar Januchak, and with this as a poster for the exhibition in question, Into the Open. And in that in that review, Januchak stated, quote, "The title clearly implies that Black art is coming out of the ghetto," unquote. Elsewhere, he asserted his view that, quote, "What the exhibition underlines over and over again is that it is not enough to be noticed finally. You must have something worthwhile to say." So my point here is that this Guardian, Observer, newspapers 30 years ago, or at the time of the emergence of this new generation of Black British artists, somebody like Januchak was very scathing about their work, broadly speaking, viewing it in terms that were perhaps not dissimilar to the comments that I quoted from Brian Sewell. Now, these papers, several decades later, cannot say enough good things about this same work. So there's a profound level of disingenuousness going on in this coverage. Coverage of the places here reflected a certain nostalgic framing of the 1980s as a decade of righteous certainties vis-a-vis struggle. The memories of, or the imagined history of struggle against Margaret Thatcher and her hated Conservative government was, after all, so much more palatable, so much simpler than the disappointments of tuition fees and the war in Iraq that were the legacy of Tony Blair and his new Labour government. So my point here is that Conservatives were in power for a number of years, from 1979 to 1997. During which time the battle lines were clearly drawn. Then along comes Tony Blair, wins the first of a number of general elections from 1997 through to towards the end of the first decade of the 21st century. But when Tony Blair comes into office, students do not have to pay tuition fees, and indeed they get grants to go into higher education. By the time he leaves office, the only way students can pass through university is if they come from very wealthy backgrounds, or they can expect to be saddled with significant debt. The other legacy of Tony Blair's time in office, of course, is the wholly illegal war in Iraq. So we're left, generally speaking, within Britain, we're left with this aftermath of the train wreck of New Labour. We are left trying to reckon with how a Labour government was able to enact these things, and in asking the questions, it's easy to turn away from asking these difficult questions and to wallow in a kind of a nostalgic revisiting of, as I say, these battle lines that were clearly drawn when Thatcher and the Conservatives were in office for that period from the late 70s until towards the mid to late 90s. In a similar vein, the struggle against apartheid, which of course it was intense for a number of decades since the introduction of apartheid in the late 40s. So we see points of intense resistance in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and into the 80s. But my point is that the struggle against apartheid was, again, after all, so much more palatable, so much simpler than the disappointments of accusations of corruption and nepotism that swirled around the ANC government of Jacob Zuma. So my point here is that when we look at the government of, in particular, Jacob Zuma, allegations, accusations, suspicions of nepotism and corruption were rife. So we look with difficulty at these considerations, and in looking with difficulty at these considerations, we can look back at previous decades with much more righteous certainty about the evil of apartheid and the righteousness of the struggle against apartheid. In some respects, I believe that these are the narratives that inform this fetishization of the 1980s. The disappointments that we've experienced subsequent to the 1980s. So there's a kind of a head in the sand kind of aspect to this fetishization. I just want to wrap up. I just want to draw things to a close by just opening up a little bit more about this about the points that I've just made mention of. So even the Financial Times, which, although it had reviewed exhibitions such as From Two Worlds, which I mentioned earlier, had no specific attention to artists and exhibitions of the early 1980s. Even the Financial Times got in on the act. Its breathless review of the places here included a narrative in which broader progressive initiatives were interwoven with what was taken to be the exhibition's resistance to Thatcherism. The 1980s was a febrile time. Margaret Thatcher was freshly in place as Prime Minister. There were riots in London and Liverpool in 1981, and again in 1985 in Brixton and Birmingham. There was enlightenment too, campaigning commissioners at the new Channel 4 who invited groups like the filmmaking Black Order Film Collective to create challenging new work. In parentheses, the 1986 Handsworth Songs, a fragmented and disturbing collage of riot footage, archival material, and interviews, is being shown in Nottingham. It was part of the places here. Curators like Sandy Nairn at the ICA dared to put on a Robert Mapplethorpe show in 1983. It got closed down, but not before it opened a few eyes. Isaac Julian's experimental film Territories, 1984, which looks at Black identity through the lens of the annual Notting Hill Carnival, was even funded by the police committee. So hopefully it's not difficult to ascertain the ways in which the 1980s are being retrospectively viewed through these reviews as some kind of period of intense social resistance to the right-wing government. It's likely that some of these reviewers were too young to have experienced the 1980s themselves, but some of them would certainly recall the 1980s as a point in which the battlegrounds with Thatcher and the Conservatives were clearly drawn. So there's an element of utilizing the work of British artists to give form to this kind of nostalgic reading of the 1980s. Anyway, I'm going to stop there. I think I've used 50 minutes, so I'm going to stop there, and I shall stop sharing this screen. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Chambers. And the floor is open if there's any questions.
Is that one in the Q&A, or should I not touch the screen?
No, it says, are there catalogs available from any of the shows referenced here?
Oh, right. Okay. Yes, that there are. They're relatively hard to come by. The other story is probably the one that's the hardest to come by, but there are copies available that come up on bookseller sites, and they start round about $300 or so. Sometimes copies can be a lot more expensive, but unfortunately, it's one of these catalogs that's become much more expensive than the original would have been. And catalogs such as The Other Story, Thin Black Line, these are also available if one perseveres in looking. They're not routinely or regularly available. One has to kind of hunt for them and keep hunting for them. But they are certainly available. And also, of course, a number of libraries have them. So because a number of libraries have them, then the possibility of interlibrary loaning something exists.
Yeah. So that question was from Melissa Hunter Davis, and so is this one. Can you guide us to a reading list on Black British art?
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure if I can just kind of make one kind of just here and now, an impromptu one, but certainly there are a number of key texts, some of which are possibly available as PDFs. So certainly, it is possible to create a kind of a reading list. I know I've been critical, and I am critical of Shades of Black, but Shades of Black has some texts in it which are very useful and very, very relevant and pertinent to the history of Black British artists. And it's an area that of which there is increasing scholarship. I mean, so obviously it's all relative in terms of the amount of scholarship, but it's an area that is getting more attention, albeit relatively piecemeal still.
So this is from an anonymous attendee. It says, hello, Dr. Chambers. Did these exhibitions contribute to the depiction of Black British people in popular media? If so, are there any specific examples you can think of?
Yes, well, certainly. I think towards the tail end of my lecture, I'd mentioned Handsworth Songs. Handsworth Songs is an often cited, still widely circulated. Of course, it's not available. It's not available outside of specific exhibition environments, so it's not on Vimeo or anything like that. But The Other Story is a hugely important document for lots of reasons, but partly because of the ways in which it applies a kind of a very close, critical, but eye-opening lens to the ways in which Black British people are perpetually framed in proximity to deviance and criminality. So Handsworth Songs is a hugely important text, a filmic text in that respect. There's also I think it was referred to possibly in one of the reviews, the work of Sankofa. So there's a film, Sankofa being the film group that Isaac Julian was involved in. So one of his films, or several of their films, very much again consider consider the visibility or the ways in which Black British people are visible, made visible through the lens of the media.
This is from Beverly Mason. She says, what might Dr. Chambers say about the artists' visibility who formed the Caribbean art movement in the context of Black art movement's emergence? Were they eclipsed by the media?
Well, certainly, I'd made mention briefly about the artists of the Caribbean arts movement and the ways in which they were retrospectively kind of embraced by the British art establishment. And Aubrey Williams, obviously a leading figure of the Caribbean art movement, somebody who I think was dreadfully disrespected by the British art establishment during his lifetime. But I think it was 8 years after his death. It was in 1998. The Whitechapel held a major exhibition of Aubrey Williams' work, and the Walker Art Gallery in Liverpool also hosted a major exhibition of his work. Both exhibitions coming with important catalogues in many respects. Roland Moody was another artist associated with CAM, who again, attention to him has been retrospective. Roland Moody was very active in certain circles during his lifetime, but very much not extending to the British art establishment. We have yet to see substantial scholarship on Moody. There are a couple of articles, but nothing in the way of a book-length project or anything like that at the present time. But certainly those artists, those early generation artists associated with CAM, even now they have a very kind of fragile profile or level of appreciation.
So I have two questions from Jafari Allen. The first one is, I am fascinated by your notion of the fetishization of the 1980s. What are some of the uses of the fetish, and especially by disparate groups of folks? And the second question is, I was struck by the last slide, mentioning Carolyn Rue's note on Julian's show sponsored by the police. Would you talk a bit more about who funds projects of exhibitions, memory, and archiving in the UK?
Yeah, well, let me start. I mean, I think probably anyway. Let me start with the second question. I mean, funding is always a precarious matter. Access to funding, projects live or die on the basis of their access to funding or the extent to which they're unable to access funding. Which within this general culture, I think it has led certain people to be innovative in terms of where they seek funding from. But the bigger picture is that the Arts Council, which is the state funding body, the national funding body, has a very kind of inconsistent attitude towards funding Black artists and projects associated with artists of color. And we can look at Innova as the example of this. The Arts Council invested relatively significant sums of money in the creation of Innova, the Institute of International Visual Arts. Later, after several years, they worked with David Adjaye, the architect David Adjaye, who built a home for Innova in Shoreditch, in the Shoreditch area of northeast London. and then for reasons that I've never fully understood, the Arts Council radically reduced its funding to Inova, and Inova ended up being evicted or expelled from the building that was built for them. These are the kind of the antics, the kind of nonsensical antics of state funding bodies, and the poor profile of Black artists is partly down to the antics of the funding bodies. This is particularly difficult. This is a particularly difficult issue because the funding bodies also have this kind of the Arts Council. They have this kind of Stalinist kind of enforcement of cultural diversity, to the point where you engage with the Arts Council, and it's almost like they're obsessed with implementing what they see as equitable cultural diversity. Of course, it's nothing of the sort. It's this kind of hollow, as I say, quasi-Stalinist nonsense, which does no good to the genuine prospects of Black art, of artists of color being accorded proper exhibitions. There are probably a number of other things that I could put in the mix, but in the interest of time, I should probably move on to the other part of the question, or at least try to address the other part of the question. In constructing these narratives around this idea of fetishization, it seemed to me to be an appropriate word, given the very intense ways in which a limited range of work by a limited range of artists was being overly attended to. In effect, the work was being fetishized at the expense or at the cost of the profile of a far greater number of artists. Had time allowed, I would have talked a little bit about artists such as Eugene Palmer, Denzel Foster, all sorts of artists who emerged in the 1980s, but who have no place whatsoever in these over-attended to narratives. This is a disgraceful state of affairs, in which a smaller number of artists are, for no good reason, privileged over a far greater number of artists who have every right to be in this 1980s mix.
Karen McKinnon says, Dr. Chambers, how would you go about advising critics of papers such as The Guardian and Evening Standard to review Black British artists from the 80s? Would it be too easy for them to reference their lack of reviewing shows of Black British artists in the 1980s, or the way they frame the artists if they did review them?
Well, clearly it's for in the first instance, it's for galleries to put on the exhibitions that they want to put on, and in similar vein, we have to concede, or we have to accept that it's for magazines and newspapers or whatever to review whatever they choose to review. My point, or what I'm concerned about, is that there are too few curators and directors of galleries who have inquiring minds to the point where they're interested in a wider body of artists. Similarly, people who write art criticism for the national press or for any kind of press, too often these people are also have kind of dull minds where they're not interested in reaching beyond what is shoved under their noses. This is a state of affairs that indicates that these people are not massively kind of engaged with their subject, but really much more exist in some kind of opportunistic vein. And of course, this goes for gallery directors as much as it does for journalists and art critics. There's a level of shallowness and opportunism in what gets in certain dimensions of what gets shown in galleries, and this is reflected in what gets written about on the art pages of newspapers. The bigger picture, of course, is that there are significant numbers of artists of equal merit, of at least equal merit, who are not being given access to gallery exhibitions, and of course, by extension, are not being written about. And where these artists, where the wider bodies of artists do get to have their work shown, they're not being written about. So one can see patterns of, opportunism and so on at play in these narratives. And this is a frustration, isn't it? It's sorry, I should say it is for me a frustration, because I'm always looking to see more, I'm always looking to learn more, I'm always looking to engage with more and more wider circles of artists, rather than having the same old shoved in front of me.
Great. So I think we could finish with this last question from Rosie Gordon-Wallace, which brings us to the present. It says, what are you curating or working on in Austin? What music are you listening to? And how are you responding to the global Black Lives Matter movement in Austin?
Well, I must admit, I've not been in Austin for some time. I was there briefly in October, November, but since the pandemic, I've actually been based in the UK. But the Black Lives Matter, one good thing about being in the UK is that I've seen close hand the ways in which the Black Lives Matter movement has crossed the Atlantic and really gripped the imagination and really engaged people in the UK. I mean, people of all ethnicities, or of a range of ethnicities. I should stress that. And in some respects, events in Britain have had such a marked influence on the ways in which we talk about certain things. I'm talking specifically in the first instance about the tearing down of the statue of Edward Colston in the 18th century slaver in Bristol. I lived in Bristol for many years, since 1980, from 83 up until whenever, I mean, 2014, I think it was, or thereabouts. And I know firsthand how much the forward-thinking people of Bristol pleaded with the council to get rid of this wretched statue, but to no avail. So when, in the course of a Black Lives Matter rally, the statue of Colston was pulled down, it was a key moment. It was a very intense, important moment that I think had a profound effect on all sorts of dialogue around statuary and what should or should not be given the status of occupying plinths within our towns and cities. So this is one dimension of the Black Lives Matter. Of course, within the US, we know that there's a long history of pushback against all sorts of unpleasant monuments. But the ways in which these issues are manifest in Britain, or were manifest in Britain last summer, this is hugely important. I know I didn't say much about Austin and the music scene there or whatever, but so I've not been in Austin for a while. I mean, one thing I can say about Austin is that it's getting extraordinarily expensive to live there, and it has a decreasing African American the African demographic is a shrinking one. So this is quite an alarming situation. African Americans are leaving Austin in significant numbers. So it's certainly a troubling situation in terms of the gentrification and other factors.
Well, I think that was great. Thank you, Dr. Chambers, for everything, and thank you everyone for joining us. And we'll see you on the 27th.
Thank you all so much. That was wonderful. It was a great opportunity. So thank you very much, Jean, for this invitation. It's a wonderful experience, a wonderful opportunity for me. Thank you so much.
Thank you.